but we're very glad to be here on Unbound Radio. Now, we have the problem today of doing justice to the fakery around the Boston Marathon bombing and subsequent events. So we need to go into that in some detail. But at the same time, I cannot stress enough, if you make that the main object of your attention and your agitation and your efforts, then you are falling into precisely the trap which this Boston story represents. In other words, it is a diversion. The main issues of the day remain the fight against economic austerity, the fight for the economic rights of the American people, to beat back the reactionary Republicans, the Rand Pauls, and the other right-wing extremists who want to strip the American people of their economic rights. And at the same time, to lead the country out of a depression. When we're talking about economic issues of this magnitude, we are talking about the potential for hundreds of thousands or millions of deaths. This is the biggest issue. It eclipses all others by far. However, we've also got to bear in mind that we've got to be looking towards the obvious attempts now to escalate the war in Syria, to get more foreign intervention into it. We've got to watch the nefarious activities of John Forbes, Skull and Bones Kerry, who's coming now, has indicated an escalation of this war. And generally speaking, needless to say, we are in a sharp right turn, an extreme right-wing turn by the Obama regime. This entire mask of populism or some kind of openness to left-wing causes from the Osawatomie speech in late 2011 till about the end of last week or two of March, that has been dropped, and you're now dealing with a right-wing Wall Street Democrat who operates behind these issues of gun control and concessions on gay rights to keep his left cover intact. The main issue is the economic issue. What the American people, where you can organize the American people is on the fight to protect Social Security from the chained consumer price index and to protect Medicare from the $1.1 trillion worth of cuts that Obama is bringing in. However, at the same time, we've got to refute and undercut these diversions which are being launched. But we've also got to be aware of the general situation in the world. I think we can say that we are dealing with a strategy of tension, a classic NATO intelligence strategy of tension. But of course, what does that mean? How was it ever introduced? The purpose of any strategy of tension is to break or prevent a strike wave. It is to chill, to suppress mass activity against austerity. That is the first strategy of tension in December 1969 in Italy, designed to break the mass strike wave known as the Hot Autumn. The biggest strike wave in Western Europe since World War II was successfully broken at that time by bombs put in this bank in Milan. So this is the model. It's based on exaggeration, and it's based on counterinsurgency. Welcome back to the Webster Tarpley Program here on Unbound Radio. Delighted to be coming your way with an early week briefing, and you can follow everything that I do at tarpley.net, tarpley.net on the internet, and you can also look at the Twitter feed, Webster G. Tarpley. I was downtown at the White House on Saturday. There was a demonstration by the National Nurses United for their well-meaning Robin Hood tax. It's a bad name and it's much too small, but their hearts are in the right place. So the United Front Against Austerity, of which I am a proud member, was down there agitating, please drop this term Robin Hood tax. This is a loser. This is a gift to the demagogues, Hannity, O'Reilly, Limbaugh, Levin, and the rest of these right-wing ravers, right? The Limbaugh Institute for Retarded Reactionary Ranting. And instead, make it a 1% tax. Let's get $1 trillion of revenue out of Wall Street for the American people. Hit them in the labanza, hit them where it hurts, tax them. Don't just stand there and call them names like Occupy, those impotent anarchists from Adbusters and the Situationist International, but actually do something to break their power. And the way you do that is to show the American people either Wall Street pays for this depression or you will lose your Social Security and your Medicare. So this is the main issue. But now we have also got what the class enemy, the oligarchy, right? Because it's a class. Oligarchs are a class. The class enemy is putting up this strategy of tension, right? We had this circus, right? This a German general that I used to know would have called it ein Affentheater, an ape theater in Boston, right? Shut down the city, bring in buses, tell people to get on the buses, get them out of their homes, shut down several million people for this to happen, right? Whereas in preceding cases, this had not been the level of shutting everything down. So it's designed to create a kind of mass terror and disorientation. And notice that this is proceeding regionally, right? We've had the attempt to impose fascist rule or practically fascist rule in Wisconsin at the beginning of 2011, breaking unions, driving down the standard of living of state workers. And then you've also got what we're in the middle of right now in Michigan, right, with the obvious neo-fascist governor Rick Snyder and his policy of sending in these austerity dictators to run cities, and it's now reached Detroit, right, after Flint, Benton Harbor, Pontiac, and so forth. So this is creeping fascism, but in different places, right? You're not likely to have somebody like Walker or Snyder in Massachusetts, so instead you've got Deval Patrick, a kind of, I've written about him, he's basically out of the same stable as Obama, right? A stable of political kindergarten, which also included in a broad sense Obama. So with Deval Patrick and these people, you can essentially break the spirit of a whole region of the United States by imposing this circus, right, which was done around these tragic deaths, of course, which we condemn. And remember, our standing point is we're against terrorism. We're seeking to stop terrorism, and we have some ideas on how we can do that a whole lot better than the FBI seems to be able to do it. So now let's just look. The worldwide framework for this strategy of tension. Well, you've got the Boston Marathon bombings. You've got the ricin letters going to Obama and this senator, right? It's interesting that they have not gotten much attention. We've had that explosion at the Texas fertilizer factory, West Texas. And now we've got the Canadian train bombing. This is also quite interesting. The Canadian train bombing is attributed by Sergeant Preston of the Yukon, right, the Royal Canadian Mounted Police. They say it's Al-Qaeda of Iran. Al-Qaeda of Iran. Can we believe our ears? Have they just gone absolutely wild, mad, right? Do they have recent college graduates putting these indictments together based on recycled material from old term papers or creative writing classes or the internet? We're told it's Al-Qaeda in Iran, and then in parentheses, sick. Yes, that is really what we mean. So it's the attempt to bomb the New York to Toronto Amtrak train, I guess it is. And the Canadian Mounties, who always get their man, are accusing Chiheb Essegayer and Raid Jazer. And this, of course, is absolutely out of this world, because they're saying that the plan was made by Al-Qaeda circles in Iran. Now, there is a deep hostility, enmity, conflict between Al-Qaeda and Iran. They do not mix. To the average chauvinist, well, they're all foreigners, I guess. That seems to be the common denominator, right? And they're all some version of Islam, I suppose. But this is fundamentally wrong. The idea of Al-Qaeda in Iran is an invention. And it's a rather maladroit, stupid, invention of very, very low credibility. So the idea is that the plot was concocted by a certain Suleiman Abu Ghaith. And Suleiman Abu Ghaith was a leader of Al-Qaeda in Afghanistan, but when the U.S. came in, he fled to Iran, and he has been operating in Iran for 10 years, or at least he was, until he somehow came out of there, went to Turkey, got kicked out, went to Jordan, and somehow has now ended up in the net. The basis of this whole caper is an article by a terrorism expert, and these people are the ones you want to watch out for. They are not trustworthy. They are mercenaries. They are charlatans and what have you. But in this case, it's an article by Peter Bergen, and I've tried to act as a corrective to some of his mystifications in the recent past. Peter Bergen has an article called Strange Bedfellows, Iran and Al-Qaeda. And the idea is that somebody, some character, Saif al-Adel, another Al-Qaeda leader, is also operating from Iran. Notice, they don't say it's the Iranian government. They're not trying to pin this on Ahmadinejad, but they are alleging that it comes from Iran. So that's, from their point of view, that may be just as good, right? You can say the United States government has now decided to attack Iran because the Iranian government has been unable to prevent Al-Qaeda from operating from its territory. You get the idea. As soon as it's Iran, you better watch out. If the FBI had come forward and said the bomber in the Boston Marathon was a North Korean, would you have believed that? A Syrian, how about that? Or an Iranian. Well, they didn't do it there, but they've come rather close. We've now got Iranians, or the Iranian territory, being accused of being a terrorist sanctuary. So you look at that, that's a rather heavy dose of strategy of tension. Boston Marathon, Ricin Letters, Texas Blast, Canadian Train. There's constant bombing going on in Iraq. I guess this maybe doesn't factor in so directly, but you do get the idea. And we've also got a car bomb has gone off at the French embassy in Tripoli, Libya. It is the first attack on a Western embassy. It's the first attack by, I would say, death squad forces inside Libya against the embassies of the NATO countries that overthrew Gaddafi in the infamous bombing campaign and death squad invasion of 2011. Now, there may, of course, be an attempt by the agents of the controlled media to say, oh, this bomb, the car bomb at the French embassy in Tripoli, is the work of pro-Gaddafi nostalgics, right? So they'll say, no, it's not the wonderful death squads, the Salafists and the jihadis and the Belhaj people, right, that we brought in, the Al-Qaeda in the Islamic Maghreb, or the these other groups. No, it's not them. It's those Gaddafi holdovers. The French Foreign Minister Fabius has been flown in. Kerry, John Forbes, Skull and Bones Kerry, our blue blood oligarch Secretary of State, under whom things have gotten hot fast, typical Skull and Bones, I guess. Kerry is telling us, get ready for Syria to use chemical weapons. The Israelis have already said Syria has used chemical weapons. So the buildup of the chemical weapons story, which is obviously can only be an attempt to create the basis for an armed intervention, that is going on. Even though the NATO powers continue to tell the Syrian death squads that they're not going to get an invasion in their favor at the most recent meeting, this is a separate track. And once the chemical weapons stuff reaches a certain level, then the pretext for the invasion, or bombing certainly, more likely, is going to be there. All right, so now let's look at the situation with the Boston Marathon. Now, I have to, quoting oneself is never a very elegant procedure, but there's no way around it. If you want to understand the Chechen rebel story, you've got to look at 9/11 Synthetic Terror Made in USA. And if you have the fourth edition is a very good place to find this stuff. I don't think it's in the previous editions. I think it may be in the fifth edition. I've still got to check that. But the fourth edition has it. Now, Chechnya is one of these small republics. It's part of this so-called ethnic labyrinth of the Caucasus, Southern Caucasus, Transcaucasus, whatever you want to call it. It's places like Chechnya, Dagestan, Ossetia, Ingushetia, and so forth. This is a terrorist, separatist movement, and it's terrorist. If you call them rebels, you're basically hewing to the NATO style book. Remember, in the NATO view, anybody who attacks a Western country is a terrorist, but if you're rebelling against Moscow, you can be a rebel and you can be democratic and you can be a democratic force. As a matter of fact, if you're against Putin, you probably are a democratic force from the NATO point of view. Go back to September 2004. Terrorists attacked a school in Beslan, North Ossetia, in the Russian Federation. 335 dead, about 180 or 190 of them are small children. Now, this is all in 9/11 Synthetic Terror Made in USA, starts on page 425. I urge you to read this. Here's the thing. The Russian media and the Russian government are pulling their punches right now, which I think is not wise, but they're doing it. They're not giving you the full story on who's behind the Chechen terrorists, because this is now a hot thing. And the issue, of course, is who's behind the Chechen terrorists. The CIA is behind the Chechen terrorists. The U.S. has acted as a sponsor. I don't know if it's the sponsor, but certainly a sponsor, U.S., CIA, along with the MI6, of course, historically there, and probably Saudis and Qatar to provide the money. But in the case of the guy who did the attack on Beslan, North Ossetia, this is the infamous Shamil Basayev. And Shamil Basayev is notoriously a CIA agent. So at the time that this happened, shortly after it, within a couple of weeks, Putin had essentially delivered an indictment to the international press, which I'm going to give you a summary of here in the next segment. But the overarching fact, without which you can't understand anything, is that the Chechen terrorist, rebel, separatist movement, call them the terrorists, that is a creature of NATO intelligence. And that is the mother, the milieu, the patsy milieu from which this all emerged. So we'll be back in just a minute on Unbound Radio with the Webster Tarpley Program. Welcome back to the Webster Tarpley Program here on Unbound Radio. Now, framework is when Putin was speaking somewhat more bluntly than the Russian government has now. Let's say Putin before the Medvedev era. Putin before the Medvedev era was rather more blunt about this entire complex of problems. And what Putin was doing was essentially in September of 2004, at the beginning of right after this Beslan school event, Putin invited 30 Western correspondents to his dacha outside Moscow, his summer house, country house, small country house. And he talked with them for 3.5 hours about what had happened. And he said that essentially delivered an indictment against the Western intelligence services for what had just happened, although he did this without naming them. So I'll give you the version from Le Monde. Daniel Vernet, Monsieur Poutine accuse et s'explique sur la guerre totale au terrorisme. Le Monde, September 8th, 2004. U.S. press naturally, got rid of this, right? They junked it. Monsieur Putin restated the accusation he had launched in a veiled form against Western countries which appeared to him to use double talk. On the one side, their leaders assure the Russian president of their solidarity in the fight against terrorism. On the other hand, the intelligence services and the military, who have not abandoned their Cold War prejudices, in Putin's words, maintain contacts with those Chechens, in this case, whom the international press calls the rebels. Why are those who emulate bin Laden called terrorists and the people who kill children in Russia rebels? Where is the logic? And then Putin answers his own question. Because certain political circles in the West want to weaken Russia, just like the Romans wanted to destroy Carthage. But we will not allow this to come to pass. It is, according to Putin, a bad calculation because Russia is a factor of stability. By weakening Russia, the Cold War nostalgics are clearly acting against the interests of their own country. In Putin's words, we are sincere champions of anti-terror cooperation. We are open and loyal partners. But if foreign services have contacts with these rebels, i.e. terrorists, they cannot be treated as reliable allies in the way that we want to be for them. He declines to name the countries. He says the aim of this international terrorism, supported more or less openly by foreign states, CIA, MI6, whose names the Russian president does not want to state, is to weaken Russia from the inside by criminalizing its economy, by provoking the disintegration through propagating separatism in the Caucasus and the transformation of the region into a staging area for actions directed against the Russian Federation. So there you have it. It's an indictment of the Western intelligence agencies. And at this time, let me just cite you a couple of other things from all to be found in 9/11 Synthetic Terror, Made in USA, 4th edition. Here we have a Russian news agency, KMN News RU. The school seizure of Beslan, the one that killed 330 people and 180 or 190 kids, school seizure was planned in Washington and London. Shamil Basayev, the brutal Chechen field commander, is known to be a NATO agent. Also, Aslan Maskhadov, the British had given asylum to a Chechen representative, and the U.S., let's mention the British one, Ahmad Zakayev, December 2003, and the U.S. gave asylum to Ilyas Akhmadov, the envoy of Basayev, the school killer. That was August 2004. Basayev was viewed in European circles as a straight-out CIA agent who openly claimed responsibility for the school massacre 2 weeks after the fact. So, KMN News then goes on. Chechen terror boss on U.S. State Department payroll. Here they're pointing, the Russian agency is accusing Ilyas Akhmadov, and we'll talk about him in just a minute. Another headline from KMN News. Terror supporters on the banks of the Thames and on the banks of the Potomac. We'll be back in just a minute. Welcome back to the Webster Tarpley Program. So we've just gone through the indictment issued by Russian President Vladimir Putin back in September 2004 in a 3.5-hour personal briefing to a group of Western journalists at his Moscow dacha, which, of course, was blacked out by the New York Times, the Washington Post, although still in those days reported by some Europeans. I've given you some of it from Le Monde, but the Germans, Italians, and so forth, they know about it, but you can't know because you're in the Anglo-American culture ghetto, and you got to be dumb. They want you to dumb you down. So that's why programs like this one are a good antidote. And, of course, books like 9/11 Synthetic Terror, Made in USA, which is what I've just been going through for you. Now let's switch to Obama, the Postmodern Coup. And here we find on page 97 an article about precisely the current issue. It's embarrassing to have to say it, but this book is prophetic. Obama, the Postmodern Coup, The Making of a Manchurian Candidate, is essentially an inventory of just about everything of importance that has happened and is happening and maybe will happen in the Obama regime. In particular, the article I'm talking about now, quote, Obama campaign linked to Chechen terrorism. Subtitle, kicker. Grant of taxpayer-funded U.S. asylum for Chechen terror envoy gave Obama foreign policy gurus Zbigniew Brzezinski one of the happiest days of my life. February 2nd, 2008, more than 5 years ago, I'm writing about Obama campaign linked to Chechen terrorism. And here's the idea. We've got this guy, Ilyas Akhmedov, the representative of the Chechen rebel movement. He's a representative of Aslan Maskadov and Shamil Basayev, both dead, both killed by the Russians in firefights or other operations. But we've got Ilyas Khamzatovich Akhmedov. We've had him in Washington, and he's had not just asylum, but he's had a Dante Fasel Ronald Reagan fellowship that gives him an income. He's paid for by you. You pay for his office. You pay for his secretary. You pay for his travel budget, and you pay for his public relations budget. And unfortunately, the presence of Ilyas Akhmedov he's largely a protege of the Brzezinski family, in particular of Zbigniew Brzezinski. And the idea, of course, is, this was implicit in some of the things Putin was saying, you have Cold War anti-Russian nostalgics in the U.S. Power structure who want to promote the Chechens because this is a huge way to destabilize the Russian Federation. I would love to hear the Russians really tell what they know about this, but they're obviously not doing it. So I have to do within my own limits what I can. And of course, these are petty Polish aristocrats who just hate Russia, and they want to use the United States as a vehicle for such hatred. So we had a big fight about whether Ilyas Akhmedov should get asylum in 2003, 2004, and we had the Russian embassy coming in saying he's a terrorist. There's no doubt about it. We have proof. Russia has demanded the extradition of Ilyas Akhmedov as a terrorist, as a killer. The United States says no. The Russian media then says, how would you feel if Moscow were a sanctuary for Osama bin Laden, that he could operate there and be paid by the Russian government? Akhmedov's presence in Washington is already a major irritant in U.S.-Russian relations. We've got U.S. professors saying this guy should be kicked out of the United States. In particular, we want to add not only the Beslan School of August-September 2004, but 1995, the attack on the Russian hospital in Budyunovsk, north of Chechnya, 100 miles into Russia. Here we have 100 hostages, women and children killed by the Chechen terrorist groups. Interestingly enough, in 2003, in the House Judiciary Committee, Chairman Sensenbrenner objected. John Hostetler of Indiana objected. They demanded that Ashcroft not do this, but it was done, and it was done under Bush, Ashcroft, and Condi Rice. So this is, of course, a huge bipartisan monstrosity. So Akhmedov, according to Professor Robert Bruce Ware of one of the universities here, this guy should be asked, Ilyas Akhmedov should be asked to leave the United States. Now, the Chechen community, apparently small, according to what we read, that we're told that there are maybe 200 Chechens in the United States. We're told that there are maybe 30, 40 in the Boston area, but that's the biggest concentration. There are, by contrast, 130,000 Chechens in Europe, Western Europe, I mean. What is going on here? It certainly looks like the Chechens in the United States are a carefully selected group that before they're given asylum they obviously have to be vetted. And the question is, vetted for what? Well, my proposal, my hypothesis would be, based on long experience, that this community provides a patsy milieu from which terrorist operatives can be recruited. But, watch out, they can just as easily be patsies as they can be technicians. And by that I mean moles, patsies, technicians. If you don't know those distinctions, get yourself a copy of 9/11 Synthetic Terror, Made in USA, any edition, better the fifth. But if you don't know the breakdown on moles, patsies, and technicians, you don't know anything. You can't understand terrorism. Can't hope to. So this is a patsy milieu. Now, what's the story with this specific family? There are some general, media chatter, I guess, that the father of these boys was somehow involved in the rebellion. This is Anzor Tsarnaev, who is now back in Dagestan, but he is the one who says his sons were set up, that they were patsies, I guess is what that means. This is quite possible in the sense that we really have to look critically and carefully. What is the evidence that associates them with this bombs? Those pictures don't cut the mustard, and other things that we're told don't cut the mustard. This entire story of what supposedly happened on Friday morning with the attempt to hijack a car, rob a 7-Eleven, first, yes, rob it, then not rob it, I don't know. That is a chaotic story, right? Some people have said this is the patrolman Tippett of the two marathon bombers, right? Patrolman Tippett back in Dallas in 1963 with Oswald, allegedly killed by Oswald, but this story has never made sense. I think we would also need to look, just for 1 second, let me mention it. We won't be able to go through this in much detail, but the recent case that I would propose as somewhat of a parallel is maybe still not very well known to people in the U.S. It is the story of Mohammed Merah, the Toulouse killer, allegedly. This is the killer of Jewish school children at a Jewish school in Toulouse in southwest France about a year ago now. And Merah was an informant of the DGSE. He was a controlled asset of the French foreign intelligence. He was even somehow in a personal relation with a guy called Bernard Squarcini, Mohammed Merah of Toulouse, an agent of Bernard Squarcini of the DGSE, French foreign intelligence. And all of these allegations, all these killings were pinned on him, but they never really made the watertight case that he had done this stuff, right? He can just be a patsy who's sitting there like a potted plant while the technicians do the killing behind the scenes. And that may apply to these brothers, right? Don't jump to conclusions about them. They are patsies by now, that's for sure. But whether they're guilty of any killings, as Oswald said, I'm just a patsy. I never killed anybody. That may apply to these kids. Anyway, so was the father a part of this Chechen revolution? And now, here's where we get to the heart of the matter. Merah was an agent of Bernard Squarcini. How about these kids? All right. We're told that the two boys, the elder one, Tamerlan, I might call him Tamerlane because this is the way Tamerlan gets into English, is Tamerlane. You can read Christopher Marlowe about Tamerlane. But Tamerlane, who died now at the age of 26, 1986 to 2013, Tamerlane had gone to visit this Dagestan, Chechnya, Kyrgyzstan area in early 2012. From January to July of last year, Tamerlane Tsarnaev was over there. Before he went, and possibly as part of his attempt to get a visa, the government of the Russian Federation contacted the United States government and asked for information. They wanted this guy interviewed. And this, of course, is a remarkable aspect of the case. Right? So the Russian Federation, as Putin says, a reliable, actually forthcoming anti-terror partner. The Russian Federation says, watch out, U.S., watch out, FBI. That guy Tamerlane has gone off the deep end. He's become radicalized and dangerous, and he is prepared to join unspecified underground groups. So the FBI says that they interviewed him, and they even make a statement now. They're in the hot seat, of course, but it's much worse than most of these people seem to think. The FBI interviewed Tamerlane in the summer of 2011. And here's what the FBI statement says, quote, "The FBI did not find any terrorism activity, foreign or domestic, and those results were provided to the foreign government, i.e. Russia, in the summer of 2011. The FBI requested but did not receive more specific or additional information from the foreign government." Well, that's passing the buck. Among others, we've got Congressman Michael McCaul, MCCAUL, Republican of Texas, chairman of the House Homeland Security Committee, says, this is bad. It's new information to me. It's very disturbing that he was already on the FBI radar screen. If he was on the radar screen and they let him out of their sights, that's an issue certainly for me. Let's see how long this guy lasts on the trail. Remember, if he insists, he'll be faced with the same fate as Senator Torricelli of New Jersey or Congressman Weldon of Connecticut. Right? If you really delve in on these fairly obvious points, then you're going to be threatened with indictment. You won't be elected, and then there'll be no indictment. And we'll be back with more in just a minute. Welcome back to the Webster Tarpley Program. So we're looking at the two brothers, Tamerlane and Dzhokhar, as patsies in the coils of the strategy of tension, and essentially focusing more broadly on this Chechen rebel movement, Chechen terrorist movement, I'm afraid we have to call it, as a general milieu, sociologically speaking, a kind of gaggle of people and families that are heavily, heavily penetrated by CIA, MI6, DGSE, I'm sure, and the rest, right? So they've all got a big piece of it. The mother of the boys is Zubeydat Tsarnaeva, and she says the FBI had been checking on Tamerlane for 3 to 5 years. They knew what he was doing, what sites he was visiting. They followed his every move, yet today they say this is a terrorist act. The FBI was afraid of my eldest son because he was a leader, could stand up for himself, talked about Islam a lot. Once they officially called me and told me they don't doubt his decency, but at the same time they said he gets information from extremist sites and that they are very much afraid of him. Well, I would say a patsy, and remember, that can be anything. A double agent, a psychotic, a fanatic, a mercenary, a drug addict, organized crime elements, can be any of this. And any of that could have been the purpose of his trip to Dagestan, to Chechnya, maybe Kyrgyzia, between January and July of last year. So we're essentially 1 year into the Arab Spring, he goes off on this trip. And this is sort of the time when Mohammed Merah is also making his trip around the Middle East. And one wonders, could this have anything to do with recruiting of death squad participants for Syria? Anyway, I would like to hear comments about all of this from the following groups. There's something called the American Committee for Peace in Chechnya. The American Committee for Peace in Chechnya, founded by Freedom House. Isn't that wonderful? Freedom House, they fight for democracy, Project Democracy, National Endowment for Democracy, and all that. They fight for democracy. And in the process, of course, they have to deal with those nasty authoritarian foreign governments. I'd like to hear what they have to say about this. I would like to hear from Zbigniew Brzezinski. I'd like to say, Zbigniew, when Ilyas Akhmedov got his asylum, his permanent residency, and his money from the U.S. taxpayers, you said that was the happiest day of your life. In retrospect, is that still the happiest day of your life? Is the policy of giving political asylum to highly selected Chechen figures, has that worked? Is that been good for the United States now in the light of all this? And was this not somehow predictable? When you have the Russian government in 2011 telling the U.S. government, watch out for that guy. Now, the other thing, of course, here is the FBI molehill. Remember Governor Kane of the Kane-Hamilton Commission? The FBI failed and failed and failed and failed and failed. And we have all of these cases now. We have Wenho Lee. We have the FBI crime lab. We have the Atlanta bombing with Richard Jewell. We have the McVeigh trial. We've got the whole context of 9/11, which is what Governor Kane was talking about. Isn't it time to think about breaking up the FBI? Old Bob Mueller is leaving. Bob Mueller is leaving the FBI now. Maybe this is a good time to break it up. It is a failure. And they'll say, oh, what do you expect us to do? We can't violate anybody's civil rights. Just because the Russian government says the guy's a dangerous radical, we can't do that. But wait a minute. The FBI routinely seeks to entrap radical Muslims. They identify them, and then they generate cases against them through entrapment to get high-profile hysteria headlines and whip up the population. We just have these Bowling Green, Kentucky cases. We got two patsies in Bowling Green, Kentucky that were entrapped, and they're on their way to the big house for 50 years to life, I guess, in these cases. We've even got Little Rand Paul. Little Rand, racist Rand is out there. He's attacking essentially the 14th Amendment, right? Seeking, as always, to roll back the Civil War. Little Rand says it's time to delay immigration reforms, and we should probably think about the anchor babies, right? The automatic citizenship that's guaranteed you by the 14th Amendment. Notice, trying to use racism and fear, terrorism and so forth to attack the 14th Amendment under the guise of attacking these immigrants. And I can tell you, what we do not need to attack immigrants. There should be no attack on immigrants. What we need is a mole detector at the FBI. That's what we've needed for a long time. A mole detector at the FBI. So, my policy, as always, get everybody naturalized, get everybody normalized, regularized within 1 year. And we'll be back next week with the Tarpley Program, and you can keep up at tarpley.net, tarpley.net. See you next week. And you're now dealing with a right-wing Wall Street Democrat who operates behind these issues of gun control and concessions on gay rights to keep his left cover intact. The main issue is the economic issue. What the American people, where you can organize the American people is on the fight to protect Social Security from the chained consumer price index and to protect Medicare from the $1.1 trillion worth of cuts that Obama is bringing in. However, at the same time, we've got to refute and undercut these diversions which are being launched. But we've also got to be aware of the general situation in the world. I think we can say that we are dealing with a strategy of tension, a classic NATO intelligence strategy of tension. But of course, what does that mean? How was it ever introduced? The purpose of any strategy of tension is to break or prevent a strike wave. It is to chill, to suppress mass activity against out of a depression. When we're talking about economic issues of this magnitude, we are talking about the potential for hundreds of thousands or millions of deaths. This is the biggest issue. It eclipses all others by far. However, we've also got to bear in mind that we've got to be looking towards the obvious attempts now to escalate the war in Syria, to get more foreign intervention into it. We've got to watch the nefarious activities of John Forbes, Skull and Bones Kerry, who's coming now, has indicated an escalation of this war. And generally speaking, needless to say, we are in a sharp right turn, an extreme right-wing turn by the Obama regime. This entire mask of populism or some kind of openness to left-wing causes from the Osawatomie speech in late 2011 till about the end of last week or two of March, that has been dropped. A proud member was down there agitating, please drop this term Robin Hood tax. This is a loser. This is a gift to the demagogues, Hannity, O'Reilly, Limbaugh, Levin, and the rest of these right-wing ravers, right? The Limbaugh Institute for Retarded Reactionary Ranting. And instead, make it a 1% tax. Let's get $1 trillion of revenue out of Wall Street for the American people. Hit them in the labanza, hit them where it hurts, tax them. Don't just stand there and call them names like Occupy, those impotent anarchists from Adbusters and the Situationist International, but actually do something to break their power. And the way you do that is to show the American people either Wall Street pays for this depression or you will lose your Social Security and your Medicare. So this is the main issue. But now we have also got what the class enemy, the oligarchy, right? Because it's a class. Oligarchs are a class. The class enemy is putting up this stressed austerity. That is the first strategy of tension in December 1969 in Italy, designed to break the mass strike wave known as the Hot Autumn. The biggest strike wave in Western Europe since World War II was successfully broken at that time by bombs put in this bank in Milan. So this is the model. It's based on exaggeration, and it's based on counterinsurgency. Welcome back to the Webster Tarpley Program here on Unbound Radio. Delighted to be coming your way with an early week briefing, and you can follow everything that I do at tarpley.net, tarpley.net on the internet, and you can also look at the Twitter feed, Webster G. Tarpley. I was downtown at the White House on Saturday. There was a demonstration by the National Nurses United for their well-meaning Robin Hood tax. It's a bad name and it's much too small, but their hearts are in the right place. So the United Front Against Austerity, of which I am, we're very glad to be here on Unbound Radio. Now, we have the problem today of doing justice to the fakery around the Boston Marathon bombing and subsequent events. So we need to go into that in some detail. But at the same time, I cannot stress enough, if you make that the main object of your attention and your agitation and your efforts, then you are falling into precisely the trap which this Boston story represents. In other words, it is a diversion. The main issues of the day remain the fight against economic austerity, the fight for the economic rights of the American people, to beat back the reactionary Republicans, the Rand Pauls, and the other right-wing extremists who want to strip the American people of their economic rights. And at the same time, to lead the country out